So, hi everyone, welcome to this week where we're going to be covering what is rebuttal and engagement. So, rebuttal and engagement, first of all, people think is a secondary part of debate. So, I can just click forward. Yeah, there we go. So, the structure of this workshop is that we're going to be looking at what engagement is about, how you should come to understand it in the context of debate, and then we're going to go through about how you actually go about executing engagement and rebuttal particularly well. So, we're going to talk about how you listen to rebuttal, how you prioritize what to rebut, how you structure it in your speech, and how you execute rebuttal, and also talk about a little bit about engagement in terms of points of influence. So first, how you should start to think about rebuttal in a debate. So the first mistake that loads of people typically make is that they think rebuttal is like this independent secondary thing to their case. So they think that it's something they just do at the beginnings of their speech so that they can run that constructive case. And they believe that constructive case is the thing that's going to actually win them debates or make them place high in debates. And so rebuttal is just this thing that you have to do because judges like you doing it. And you just have to do it because sometimes other people's arguments prevent you from running your actual constructive case. This is not actually how you should be thinking about rebuttal. Rebuttal is a contribution in and of itself. It's very possible for you to actually come like a solid second if you have excellent rebuttal and absolutely nothing else. So for example, if you're in CG and you had just had no extension, if you just focused all of your time coming up with the most brilliant rebuttal that takes up both op teams, you can place second in a debate from that alone. And so because of that, don't think of rebuttal as something that's just a secondary part of your case, that is just subservient to what your constructive is going to be. It can be potentially winning material. So secondly, what you should think of rebuttal as is that it should always be tied to your case. If you keep thinking about rebuttal as independent of your case, a lot of times what you'll find is that your rebuttal can undermine what your constructive case is attempting to run. So a really good example is something that happened, I think, a couple of weeks ago when we were sparring, and then the motion, I believe, was about whether or not universities should prioritize diversity in hiring over actual qualifications. And so OG, of course, ran all the good arguments about, if you increase diversity in a faculty, this means they can do more great research into more niche topics. That means minority students maybe have more role models in academia. They can tackle things like workplace discrimination to a much higher degree, et cetera, et cetera. Opening opposition came up and attempted to mitigate a lot of these benefits that OG was bringing, and attempted to say hey, actually in status quo without this motion, loads of universities have the organic incentive to hire diversity anyway. So a lot of the benefits that OG were bringing are not mutually exclusive. Now this is brilliant mitigation on its own, but then the constructive case started to say, well, this motion actually causes a lot of backlash because you think that you're just a diversity hire, your co-workers don't think you necessarily earned your place. But note how these two things are in tension with each other, because if the mitigation was premised on the idea that diversity hires are happening anyway and therefore OG's impacts are non-exclusive, then it also mitigates the harm that opening opposition was trying to bring about. So this is the problem when you think of rebuttal as independent of your case. Often, sometimes you can undermine your case if you think of them as two separate entities that operate independently of each other. You need to be super careful and consider that they make one coherent worldview, one coherent case. So all rebuttal must be tied to your case, and all goes towards tipping the scales in the judge's head that goes towards you winning the debate. So this means either maybe it is mitigating others' rebuttals, maybe it's taking down other people's arguments, or maybe it's rebuilding your own case. So don't try to lower your own impacts. And third thing to note, rebuttal doesn't exist in a binary. So often people try to, I think, reach too high and try to say that either an argument is true or not true, but rather rebuttal a lot of times exists on a spectrum, right? Sometimes you can mitigate a lot of impacts or mitigate the extent to which it is true. And so note that you should never think of rebuttal as something that completely takes down a case, or it doesn't
at all. It always takes down a case to a varying level of degree, and you should always, in that case, prioritize the rebuttal that is the most destructive. So if you have a bunch of layers of rebuttal to an argument, for example, prioritize the ones that are the most destructive to a case, rather than seeing them all as equal because they all exist in this binary of successful versus unsuccessful. Rebuttals exist on spectrum. Choose rebuttal wisely, and in that case, also choose your mitigation wisely, because they can be also varying degrees of successful. So how do you actually rebut? So note that lots of people tend to be a little bit what we call uncharitable to what other people's arguments. So the way that you avoid doing this is that you approach all arguments that your opponent is making from a neutral state. So try to see their arguments as a judge would see them. Maybe they're not the best arguments, maybe they're not the most persuasive, maybe they're missing analytical links, but try to look at it as a judge would, right? And so because of that, when you approach it neutrally, you more correctly give them like a generous response, which is to say, even if it's not a perfect argument, you're not just going to point out that it's an imperfect argument, therefore it falls. You need to engage with it and just try to rebut what is there anyway. Yeah. And so let's see, let's go ahead. So practical concerns, how do you actually start rebutting? So the first step of any successful rebuttal is to listen to what has been said. I cannot identify this enough. Loads of people think they listen to other people's speeches. This is completely untrue for even high-tier debaters. Lots of debaters will choose to rebut the headlines of people's arguments rather than the analysis that's actually substantively given. This shows that they're not actually listening to what the speaker is saying, but rather just like tuning in when it's convenient. So for example, if you're an opening opposition and your OG comes up and says, hey, like maybe it's about the university doing diversity hires, you can say, OG says like, we think this will be great because minority students will have more role models. And then they spend the rest of their speech, like, you know, giving like really concrete analysis about how this works, you know, like how minority students feel currently, how this is going to change, why this is going to be impactful for their futures, blah, 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 blah. Opening opposition may come up and just choose to rebut the headline of the case, which is like, you know, diversity hires will act as role models, and they'll just rebut that and not actually rebut any of the specific analytical links that OG has given to prove that statement is true. And so when you're rebutting, always be generous in your listening. So try to rebut the specific analytical links that people are giving rather than just the headlines of people's cases. Furthermore, on that same base note, try to also actively listen. So this is, I think, something that is refined through experience, but I think that the problem with also lots of people's rebuttals is they're not correctly listening to the correct parts. So often they will listen. So an argument is like a chain of logical links that you go step by step, or maybe it's like a pyramid where the base premise is the thing that you need to rebut. I've seen people try to rebut examples that don't matter in a debate and think that that takes out the argument, when really they just exemplified deeper analytical links that the opponent was trying to prove. So typically what you have is a premise to an argument, then a bunch of analytical links based on that premise, and then you have the impact. Maybe you have an example to illustrate what you're saying. So always when you're actively listening, try to understand what the argument is premised upon, and therefore what you have to rebut. And if you're not good at this, if you're not good at this and it's been identified to you by maybe a judge or by maybe your partner, try to do more of this practice or more of this drilling where you listen to people's arguments and you correctly identify the premise of the argument. Because if you just waste time rebutting the example or just like mitigating the impact and you don't really hit the crux of the argumentation, your rebuttal is always going to be quite inherently weak. So those two notes I want to place onto listening. So always listen to the premises of the argument. So actively listen, try to understand the structure of the argument and what it is premised upon. And number two, try to listen to the specific analytical links of what people say and not just rebut the headlines of what people's arguments are. On that same note, also listen to your partner. Maybe if you don't know how to rebut something, maybe they know how to rebut something. So if your partner is trying to pass you something, so like telling you, please say this in your speech, try to figure out a way for them to effectively communicate that to you. So maybe if you're kind of a nervous person and you don't like people whispering in your ear, while you're trying to listen to a speech someone is trying to give, tell them to write it down or something and pass it to you. Tell them to type it on a computer or message you over Facebook. Or maybe if you're comfortable with them whispering in your ear, try to listen to what they're saying. So always communicate with your partner, even when you're trying to actively listen to a speech that's going on. So that's all the things I have to say about listening. Now, prioritization. So how do you choose the things that you should rebut in a debate? So first thing I want to know in this, loads of people choose the most stupid thing that people say in a speech and choose to rebut that for like 3 minutes because it feels really good to rebut that stupid thing and show how stupid your opponent is. Sometimes that this is not the most strategic thing to do. Always try to understand someone's arguments or someone's points in context to your own team strategy. So let's say someone, let's say we're having a debate about the university diversity quota thing. My opponent says something really stupid that's kind of irrelevant. So they say something like, the sky is purple, and then I'm just like, wait, that's so stupid. And then I spent 3 minutes rebutting that. So obviously this is not a strategic thing to do because it was always irrelevant to the debate, and it's completely irrelevant to my ability for my team to actually take the debate. So try to identify which points are actually relevant in the burdens of the debate and prevent you from placing higher in the debate. So these are arguments that actively obstruct your ability to run an argument. So these are arguments that contradict what your arguments try to say. So for example, if you're trying to persuade the judge that the sky is blue and the opponent says the sky is orange, that argument or that statement directly contradicts that of your argument. So you need to prioritize rebutting that before you can prioritize rebutting anything else. So try to understand contextually what arguments are the most important to rebut and don't just go for the low-hanging fruit. And so that, like I said, prioritize the material that explicitly or implicitly interacts with your case. So for example, characterizations of actors. So this is really, really typical in loads of debates where, someone will say if, to give an example, it might be this house would promote a narrative of collective guilt after huge atrocities against humanities, for example, the Holocaust. OG says, this is going to be really good because people will accept responsibility and will, give things like reparations. And the other side says, no, they're going to be really angry that you blame them for the Holocaust. And so they're going to backlash against the minorities even more. So obviously these are contradictory statements, and how they interact is based on the characterization of people, right? So are people more likely going to feel guilty, or are they more likely to backlash? That's based on how they are characterized as people. And so try to understand where the clash is being located, and then try to rebut that specific clash rather than just abstractly the argument, right? And so also prioritize teams that engage based on your strategy. So just pulling up an example that I had. Yeah, so for example, so based on that example that we just went through, just like the collective guilt thing. So OG says, people are going to internalize this guilt and they're going to act better. Opening opposition says, no, they're going to backlash. If you're in CG, and what your extension is that we have the characterization that proves that this is likely, you don't need to rebut everything that opening opposition says, because you can just be like, hey, our extension just shows that this scenario is more likely, and opening opposition hasn't proved any constructive or structural analysis that proves their side is true. And so based on that, you can choose what arguments to actually rebut based on the content of your extension or the content of your constructive case. Another example may be a motion about war. So maybe this house would indoctrinate soldiers to not feel fear. One side's the top half could just be about whether or not the wars increase, so whether or not the frequency of wars increase. And you in CG, your extension may be, we're actually going to talk about how this impacts soldiers on the ground, maybe how much sympathy they get from the general public and how much support they'll get from the state after the war is over. So that's your extension. And so you can just try to do something called washing, which is to say look, I don't want to rebut everything opening opposition has already said, because let's just face it, wars are not about whether or not soldiers can ever feel fear. That like wars are probably about whether or not your state has any resource scarcity, whether or not they like other states pose an existential threat. Those are probably the things that affect whether or not you go to war, not whether or not your soldiers feel fear or not. So because of that, that clash is irrelevant. So just by doing that, proving the irrelevancy of something, that's very good in terms of the strategy of your extension, because your extension is far more granular and specific to soldiers on the ground rather than this big impact of war that the top has talked about. So try to be quite intelligent about how and what you rebut based on the strategy of your constructive case. And so note that because of the constructive case, I've evolved my strategy about how to actually rebut. Okay, so thirdly, so preemptive rebuttal. So this is more so towards constructive speakers, but it's also quite useful to note for second speakers as well. So you can always preempt rebuttal. And so like if you're a prime minister and maybe the motions is something quite basic, this house would ban school uniforms, like if you're an OG, you definitely can already predict the opening opposition is going to come up and say, oh, but uniforms like prevent discrimination against students from poor backgrounds, or like prevents things like gender inequality, because like girls no longer really have to focus about, you know, seeming appealing to their cohorts or anything. So like you definitely know that this line of argumentation is going to come out. So therefore you can preempt this and just instantly take out that argument or make it much harder for the other side to run from the get-go. So the way that you don't do this is by explicitly saying, you know, opening opposition might run the argument that this prevents discrimination. This is far too blunt and it often doesn't work. So don't say, they might say this and this is my response to that. If you're a constructive speaker, try to do this a little bit more subtly. So for example, if you definitely know the opening opposition is going to run this discrimination argument, you as opening government may choose to, as prime minister, may choose to run an argument based on why school uniforms actually increase discrimination. For example, it gives teachers the license to inappropriately sexualize the bodies of young girls by saying that the skirts are way too short, by, you know, pointing out how sexualized their bodies are and making them uncomfortable in a school environment. So it actually increases the amount of gender discrimination. It also gives people the license to discriminate against religious lines based on uniform. So for example, people who wear hijabs might feel discriminated against because they don't fit into uniform code. And so it might actually increase the amount of discrimination that people feel. And so you can, so like just by running constructive analysis that is contradictory to what opening opposition is going to say, you already preempt a line of argumentation that your opponent is going to try to run and make it much harder for them to run it in the first place. So try to do it in a way that's more sneaky and a little bit more subtle than they might say X, and this is my response to X. So that's how you do preemptive rebuttal. So you run constructive analysis about why that rebuttal is unlikely. Good. Now next onto external and integrated rebuttal. So depending on your extension, note that you could sometimes not have to do any rebuttal at all, or you can try to integrate that rebuttal. So note that a lot of debates are based on a few key clashes in debate. They try to answer a few key questions, just like we identified in the past, or just like we identified in past workshops. So try to understand whether or not a point clashes with your material and it makes just sense to integrate it. So for example, like if the key question in the argument is about do school uniforms increase or decrease discrimination, your entire constructive could just be like giving a bunch of structural reasons about why it increases discrimination. It's therefore just, it makes more sense for you to try to rebut or address people's points while you're doing your argument. So for example, you could try to give a bunch of structural reasons about why discrimination increases with uniforms, and while you're doing that constructive analysis, say like, my opening opposition tried to tell you this is why it's not true. Now going on with the rest of my case. And so it saves a lot more time rather than just having to repeat yourself continuously, because you're trying to address the same key points in both your rebuttal and your constructive. Cool. And note that, especially if you're an extension, I always recommend prioritizing getting the extension out there, because unlike the top half where you have both the PM and the DPM, or you have the LO and the DLO to get out the case, to like give a bunch of constructive analysis, in closing half, you only have the extension speech. If the whip tries to bring out an argument or give huge amounts of constructive analysis needed to make the argument run, it won't be credited at all. So if you're an extension speaker, always prioritize getting the full argument out there, and don't waste any time on rebuttal if you think it's going to make you have less time to get the extension. You might even choose to say like, hey, let me get the extension out there and then do rebuttal. So try to be quite try to always prioritize your constructive if you're in closing, basically. Let your whip handle most of the responses. Unless the responses actively obstruct your ability to run the extension, then just choose to take down those specific arguments, then go into your extension. Cool. And this is where I'll hand over to Lucie.
Okay, cool. Just before I go on, I think we need like 3 more people to fill in the room. So if you just came or if you didn't manage to do it yet, it would be great if you could fill in the form if you want to speak and can speak after the workshop. Cool. So continuing with the practical stuff. So the next is on structure. So how to structure your rebuttal. So again, it shouldn't be just you throwing one-line responses on the other side. It should have structure, and it should be thought through in the same way as you're going to be thinking through argument or thinking through characterization, etc. So broadly, the 3 steps that you want to be following if you are doing a rebuttal are these. So 1, you're going to be outlining what I said. Secondly, you're going to be giving tiered responses. And thirdly, you're going to be explaining the implication. So going through them one by one, first in terms of saying what they said. So again, the recommendation here is you always want to make clear what you are responding to. So you don't want to just be throwing responses without specifying to the judge what specifically you are addressing. But when you are doing it, you want to be clear and concise. So you want to make it clear what you are referring to, but you don't want to give them free airtime, but just like repeating the argument and going into details, like exactly to what they said. So make it clear, one summary sentence about what they said, making it obvious what you are responding to. Again, we mentioned this before, but I think this is specifically important. The charitable reading principle really matters here. So when you are outlining the argument, you want to do it in a charitable way. So you don't want to present like some like strawmanny, misrepresented like idea of their claim or like mock them, because like very often what happens is the judge might tune out when they hear you saying a misrepresented idea of the argument, because they're going to assume that you are not going to respond properly. So even though maybe your responses afterwards are going to work for the actual argument, if you sound like you're going to be just mocking, the judge might just tune out. So always be charitable, always be as nice as possible, outlining what you are responding to. So second, in terms of the responses themselves. So again, you want to make those responses tiered. So I think the usual tiers are: 1, you want to explain why the argument is not true. Then secondly, even if it were true, why it is not important. And thirdly, even if it was as important as they want it to be, it still doesn't outweigh what you are saying. So you can spend different amounts of time on different of these 3 tiers. Sometimes, for example, there are arguments which just are quite true and you can't really argue with them, but you can very effectively outweigh them. So then you prioritize going for like the third part of the responses. But again, like those are the basic, I think you definitely heard it before, ways you can deal with an argument. So the reason why this is good is because those are multiple responses that back each other up. So when the other side is responding back to you and trying to rebuild their arguments, they have more work to do because you attacked it from different angles. And again, you can kind of give multiple reasons within the rebuttal. So for example, you want to say 3 reasons why the argument is not true, and give 3 different ones. So again, making it harder and harder to deal with your rebuttal. So especially when you're responding to the crucial points, try to make your rebuttal as robust as possible in the same way as you would be delivering your constructive. And lastly, in terms of implication, and I think this is really important, even though it might not take that much time, like very often this is like 5 seconds of your speech, but it's very important. So once you finish a rebuttal, specifically if it's something really important, when you're dealing with a really important part of their speech, you're going to explain and make it very, very clear what your rebuttal achieved. So for example, you want to say the implication of the rebuttal I've just, can I have it back?
Oh.
No, thank you. So you want to say the implication of the rebuttal I've just done is that it mitigated mostly everything they said on this, and then like this is how it now weighs up or we want to point out this took down the assumption that the entire point was predicated upon, illustrate how it was predicated upon on it, and therefore it doesn't sound likely, it doesn't sound plausible anymore. So the reason why you should do it is because you don't want to leave it up to a judge to interpret. Sometimes you might have taken down an entire point, like taken down an entire assumption, but the judge might not see it as that and might just assume that you just mitigate it, and then it might cost you maybe a ranking in the debate. So you want to be very, very clear about what you are doing and making sure that the judge knows exactly what the point of your rebuttal was and what you achieved. Cool. Can I have next slide? Okay, so just in terms of the execution itself, so like the basic of how you, now when we know where to place it and how to structure it, how do you actually do it? So I think the illustration that you see here on the slide is probably familiar to you. So in terms of how we can generally very simplistically kind of figure out how strong an argument is if you imagine that one of these axes is likelihood and one of these axes is importance, then like the bigger the end rectangle is going to be, the stronger the argument is. So if you are rebutting, you are just imagining the opposite way. So what you are trying to do is to shrink the rectangle so it's as small as possible, or even better, make it disappear completely. So then you're kind of taking it completely down. So here is like a little toolbox of what different kinds of rebuttal there are and what you can try to address. Again, this is something that we can't like teach you for every single instance, but it's something that with experience you're gonna develop the intuitions where is it helpful to address what. So just to walk through them, I think the first one in terms of counterframing, I think the last session, if you were here, we talked about this quite in depth about how you can use characterizations and like the kind of preemptive it very often functions preemptive rebuttal, how to characterize in a way that you can make the other side's argument sound irrelevant or sound them less likely. So this is one way you can do rebuttal, and it kind of merges with the characterization we talked about last week. Second, I think you can focus and try to rebut unproven assumptions. I think very often this happens in debates that concern themselves with things like bodily autonomy or privacy, etc. So what very often happens there is that teams just kind of assume that certain thing matters and they don't spend any time proving it. So for example, they just assume that privacy is something that is good and we care about, and they spend the entire case proving that why it's going to increase privacy without ever explaining why that's something important. So this is where you can kind of sneakily go and just question whether privacy is something we care about, just question whether that is a right or something good. And very easily take down the entire case through rebutting those assumptions. I think thirdly, this is quite straightforward in terms of rebutting mechanisms. So just looking at the links they are making from getting from point A to point B to their conclusion and just figuring out whether they're logical or not. Again, I think this is straightforward in terms of how we before talked about structure of arguments. You just do the kind of opposite way. You can rebut impacts. So you can question whether their impacts are going to be as big as they're claiming, or you can question whether impacts actually are negative. Sometimes teams just make the assumption that they arrive to an impact and it's going to be a good thing without actually proving it. So for example, that was in spring, me and my partner were in a debate that was about regretting the rise of non-career politicians. And one of the teams on Gov did really, really good and detailed analysis that ended up with an impact that the rise of those politicians might kind of weaken established institutions, and it might lead to rise of anti-establishment politicians. So they really well analyzed why the impact is going to occur, but they never explain why that's something that's bad. So what we did in closing up, we just pointed out, we think that's not a bad thing. We think that's a good thing, especially if the majority of people is fed up with the establishment. It is unclear why we don't want to have more anti-establishment people who can deal with the system, given that the system is probably quite shit if so many people are voting against it. So again, then they obviously didn't do too well in the round because that whole case kind of fell just by the nature of the impacts no longer sounding as anything bad or anything beneficial. So that's one thing you can do. Always ask yourself, even if maybe it sounds intuitive for you, ask, is there a way I can make it flip? And lastly, I think Jacklin already mentioned this, so just very quickly, you can also co-opt arguments. You can try to wash them, make it symmetrical. I think there was an explanation before, so just a reminder that's also one of the ways you can do rebuttal. So this is like the broad toolbox that you can use, and it should be, I think, kind of exhaustive in different ways how you can rebut. Can I have next slide? Cool. Very last thing that I just wanted to make this distinction clear for people. So I think there are two types broadly of rebuttal, aside of the more like technical things that we talked about before, now more of the nature of the rebuttal itself. So this is about contradictory versus alternative rebuttal. This might be a little bit abstract. So after I finish the example, I want to make sure that you understood what I'm saying. But in terms of what contradictory, when you're doing a contradictory rebuttal, you are explaining why the other side is untrue, why what they're saying is actively not true. Alternative means that you are explaining why something other than what they said is true. If this sounds confusing, here is an example. So imagine we are debating a motion, that is, this House opposes attempts of the feminist movement to redefine roles and behaviors traditionally associated with women, e.g. wearing makeup, trying to be a housewife, as empowering. So I actually had to judge a very similar debate a few weeks ago. That was kind of traumatizing. So now I'm getting trauma from it. But I think it's a good motion. So imagine you are opening up and you want to run the argument that many women will be alienated from the feminist movement as a result of that trying to present these traditional things as empowering, which will then compromise your ability to campaign for other things, e.g. equal pay. Does everyone understand broadly that argument that we are trying to run, just to make sure? Cool. Okay, so if so, so we are all, now imagine the Prime Minister stands up and they say, these behaviors and roles are forced on women by the society and they have no way of opting out of them. So most women resent these behaviors and roles, which is why the feminist movement needs to establish a culture where it is acceptable to opt out of these behaviors, which is compromised by celebrating them as empowering. Cool. So before I outline the responses and explain which one is contradictory, which one is alternative, just a very quick exercise. If you look at the argument, think of what kind of responses could you provide. So have a think and then feel free to unmute yourself and just say, or you can type in the chat, but please do something so I don't have to look at empty Zoom because that's depressing. Okay. Anyone has any ideas? Okay, or is it too hard? I don't know. Maybe that was too hard one. Okay, you're making me feel like a lecturer that tries to ask someone and no one's responding. It's really sad. Okay, anyway, if no one knows, then let's have the next slide and see. Okay, so two examples of rebuttal that can be given to the previous claim. So the previous claim was that women are forced by society to adopt those behaviors, so they tend to resent them, and you need to have culture that allows them to kind of get away from it without being judged. So an alternative rebuttal, that is rebuttal that explains that something else than what the other side says is true, can be something like, look, many women opt into and hold these behaviors dear. For example, women in beauty careers, women who celebrate their contributions as housewives, and many women choose these as valuable in their lives. These are not forced. So if you notice this rebuttal doesn't explain why any of the claims that PM made are untrue. It's just pointing out that there are other versions of that claim. So maybe in the end, the conclusion of this would probably be there are some women where it is forced. There are some women who are opting out voluntarily. This is an alternative rebuttal. Now, contradictory rebuttal would be explaining very clearly why what they're saying is actively not true. So For example, by saying there are no clear mechanisms for why exactly women would be forced into these behaviors. So there might be like some soft societal pressure, but opt-out is ultimately possible, which is why we see many women who don't wear makeup, who are actively pursuing their careers. So therefore, many women do buy into these norms and consider them valuable for themselves. So hi, there's Reese. So the difference here is that the contradictory rebuttal is actively explaining why the claim that women are forced into these careers or why these behaviors are forced onto women is untrue by pointing out that those forces don't necessarily exist, or if they do exist, they are very soft. Does everyone understand the difference between these two types of rebuttal? I'm going to assume that means yes. Cool. So the point of this does not mean that I want to say that one of these is worse than the other. Both of those should be used, but they should be used as complementing each other. So the best idea you can do it is to forward the contradictory rebuttal first. So first explaining why what they said is actively not true. And then you are giving the alternative rebuttal. So you are saying why there is an alternative thing that is true. So you are actively explaining why your thing is more likely than theirs through those two steps. Cool. I hope that makes sense. So if that does, then can I have next slide? So that should be all about the practical consensus in terms of rebuttal. If there are any questions before I start talking about POIs, give them to me now. No? Cool, great. Okay, so in terms of POIs, there is such thing as a point of information. But okay, so in terms of giving POIs, the first thing is that very often what you see, especially with newer teams, but it sometimes happens with more experienced speakers as well, do not be reactive in giving POIs. So don't just listen to their speech, hear the first stupid thing they say, or first thing you have some sort of response to, and immediately jump up and ask a POI. Usually these POIs might be effective to take down that one sentence they said or the one start of the point they said, but they're not going to be effective in total in helping you win. So instead, what you want to do is to, usually what we tend to do is to write your POI down in detail. I actually recommend word by word, especially if you're an ESL speaker. You don't want to kind of like stumble over your words and then get cut off at like 7 seconds because the speaker decides that you are like stuttering too much. So actually having it written literally word by word is very helpful. And then you want to check with your partner, consider your strategic plan in mind and check what you are actually achieving with that POI. So you want to pick the POI that helps your case the most possible. Note also that the POIs can target different teams, not just the speaker currently speaking. So you do not have to, if you are OG and giving POI to CO, you do not have to necessarily target the material the CO member is giving. You can be giving POIs that are kind of actually responding to opening up because because they are stronger and you didn't have like actual chance to engage with something that the DLO said. Or if you are really sneaky, you can maybe like try to weigh over your closing. So you're POIing CO, but you're actually explaining why your opening government material is better than your closing government material. So do not feel the pressure of having to address like exactly the point the speaker is currently talking about. You can give a POI that is addressing different teams, different speakers, or it's just like a reminder of your own case. So just to walk through different types of POIs that you can give. The first one that is helpful, technically is basically just used from closing, is kind of a trap/binding POI. So that's the sort of POI that you might have encountered before, the idea of do you support XYZ as well? So like if you are for this motion, would you also support, and then they ask some like weird thing that like sounds principally consistent with it and trying to force you to support it. Or just like, why do you think something XYZ happens, trying to get a concession from you so they can then use it in their own analysis and point out like, like remember when we asked the POI, like they actually conceded that line of analysis that we are just giving you. So those are useful POIs if you are in closing and you want to ask, you want to get your opening to defend things that they might not want to defend. To give an example, there was a debate, there was something about, I don't remember the exact wording, but it was basically that this house would allow members of Jewish diaspora to vote in the Knesset, so in the like Israeli parliament, in elections for Israeli parliament. So I remember the POI that was asked by the op team to the gov team was asking, if you support this, would you also support conscription of the people in the diaspora? Which can be kind of tricky, because then you have to figure out, if you do not, why is it different? If you do, you have to be prepared to like defend things that you might not want to defend, and a much larger burden. So this is why like these POIs can be quite useful, if for nothing, just to like confuse them and make them talk about something random for like 2 minutes and waste their time. The second is just basic rebuttal POI. So just pointing out that the point that they are making is untrue for X, Y, Z reason. Know that this must be concise. You probably are not going to be able to give proper rebuttal in 15 seconds. So it must be something very, very concise. Make sure you are doing that correctly. You are checking the wording properly. One thing you never should do, and it's better to give no POI than this one, is just pointing out they didn't prove something. So for example, and I've seen like good speakers do this, and it's a really bad idea, is say things like, but like you are saying this, but you didn't give any structural reasons for it. So the reason why this is bad is because you are not rebutting anything, or you are not weakening anything. You're just reminding them of something they didn't do. So the response you're going to get from the speaker is probably, thank you, I'm going to give the structural reasons right now. So you are technically helping them by pointing out what they didn't do. So never do this. If you want to point out they didn't give structural reasons, just give the opposite. So explain why the thing that they didn't prove is untrue, and give your own alternative in the POI, but don't remind them that they made a mistake without contradicting them. Thirdly, you can give a reminder POI. So that's, again, that's more useful in opening. So for example, if you're an OG and you want to make sure that everyone remembers what your case was, and you want to point out that maybe closing opposition is absolutely not engaging, you can just kind of smush your case and POI the case to make it clear to the judge, again, how your case interacts, given that maybe it was implicit. You want to make it explicit by giving that reminder POI. Or lastly, you can just weigh. So in the same way as you would weigh in your speech, you can weigh in a POI, just say your material on XYZ is less important than ours because ABC. Again, useful in opening. For example, if you do not have the opportunity to weigh your argumentation to DAS in directly, you can do it via POI. Cool. Hope all of this is cool and clear. Okay, then can I have the next slide? Oh, can you use analogies in POI? So I'm not sure what exactly you mean by it. If you could give me an example of what you think, what kind of POI you think.
So for example, if it's a classic like utilitarianism, a debate about utilitarianism, can you sort of ask a POI about special relationships that exist in society by saying, hey, if Bill Gates, let's say, lost a Bugatti Veyron or somebody stole it from him, would you as a police give it back to Bill Gates, or would you give it to the poor people to try and establish a concept?
Yeah. So I don't think this is like a special kind of POI. I think it is something like, I think it falls under like the trap binding POI. So like basically what you are doing is, if a team is running a utilitarian case, you can POI them a thought experiment that could make them contradict their own like principled foundation of the case. So I think that's fine. You can do that, and then you can point out look at them, like they actually conceded to us, like they contradicted their own principle by like making the concession to our POI. Yeah. So that's perfectly possible. So second and last on POIs, in terms of taking POIs and how you should be dealing with them. So the first thing, taking them earlier than 5:45 can be advantageous. So what like usually speakers do, especially right now, is that they wait until 5:45 and that's when they take the one POI. Sometimes it can be helpful not to wait until 5:45 and take it a bit earlier. I think the reason for it is you might have more time to respond in depth, especially if you know you're going to be taking a POI from a strong team that might be asking you something that's actually going to hurt your case. You want to make sure you might have a minute and a half to really rebuild and deal with that POI if you know it's going to be really, really strong. Also, they might have less information, so they might waste that POI on something stupid. So again, it might be helpful not to wait until 5:45. That it doesn't mean you should take it at 1 minute, but sometimes it can be helpful to take it around like 4, etc. Second thing, always take clarifications. I've seen teams refusing clarifications. Please always take them. The reasons why team ask clarifications is usually actually because you are confusing, or because it is unclear what you are standing for and the opposition team really needs that clarification to be able to run their case. So if a team asks clarification, always take it, never refuse it. It's usually for your own interest, because everyone might just be really confused about what you're doing. Or sometimes it might be something useful, like they're gonna inform you that you are debating the opposite side of the motion. That also happens. So do take clarifications. Lastly, when you are choosing where to accept POIs from, make sure you're engaging with your diagonals, especially if you are opening. You do want to hear from your closing, because they might be like putting their case forward a little bit. You might be able to deal with it. Especially if you are DLO, like very often CG actually does POI DLO their case. So make sure that you are taking diagonals, you're taking the chance to engage, ideally in both ways, so that's easier judging, and you have the opportunity to engage with that case. And take them from stronger teams. This might be unintuitive. You might be scared of like the really strong team, but very often this might be a POI that's going to point you out to a weakness in your case. You might be able to rebuild it. If you do not take it, you might miss a crucial link that maybe your closing is going to end up filling in. So do take POIs from stronger teams. It tends to be helpful. Last thing, how to respond when you do not have a response. So hopefully you usually do have a response, but if you don't, here's a couple of tricks that you can do. In terms of the binding POIs and the traps, so you want to make sure you are being vague enough and you are not binding yourself to anything. So I think one response that I find quite useful, if they ask you some like weird, would you also support XYZ? You can say something like, look, if you're going to prove that our principle is consistent with this and it would lead to it, sure, we're going to support that as well. What very often happens is that they're going to give up because they don't want to spend like 2 minutes in their speech proving why like those two situations are analogous. So you're going to get away with it. And at worst, if they end up proving they're analogous, you didn't contradict yourself. So that's a response I would recommend giving in case like they ask you some weird thing and you are not sure like if you should support or should not. Similarly, if they ask you about some weird context, like once I was asked the POI that was, why do you think the University of Comillas is doing XYZ thing? Obviously, I had no idea because I've heard about University of Comillas like once. So in those cases, they just want you to panic and say something that ends up like biting you later on. So like it's very often useful to just say like, I don't know, you tell me, and let them explain, because otherwise you might just unnecessarily like get stuck at something that you actually can't literally have a response to. Second, you can make it irrelevant. You can just point out, you can just say that this doesn't sound relevant at all, give some reasons, and miss the POI out. If you don't have a response, that might be a useful thing. You can weigh your own material. So if you don't know how to respond to the thing that they pointed out and it sounds legit, you can just explain, yeah, but okay, our thing XYZ weighs over this anyway. Also, if it was confusing, you might be correct and it was confusing for everyone. So it was confusing for the judge too. So if someone gave you a POI and you have absolutely no idea what this meant, don't get stuck. Don't try to think for a minute and try to respond to some weird thing that you generally didn't understand. Just say, I'm sorry, I really didn't understand, and move on. Very often no one understood and you would just be wasting time. The last thing that you should not be doing, and this is the absolutely last resort, if you really, really don't know and the POI was really good, you can just say you're just about to address it in your next point and then you're like, don't. But don't do that very often. That's like the last thing that you can do to avoid like looking bad because you just got absolutely destroyed by a POI. But all of these things can help you in cases of POIs that are just weird and you don't have a response. Hopefully you are going to have responses. Yusuf says, don't at me. I actually didn't at anyone. I think I've done that myself sometimes. Like sometimes it just has to. Okay, cool. So this is all about POIs. So are there any other questions about POIs before we go to a short exercise? I thought you respond by telling a joke. I don't know. Okay, so unless there are any actual questions beyond the funny stuff that you are sending, then I think that's it before the exercise. Can you just check on the next slide?
Yep, I think that's it. Okay,
Yeah,
here you go.
cool. Okay, then I'm gonna give it back to you and do the exercise.
Cool. So here we're doing a role-playing exercise where you're up with, and you have the entire debate before you, and you need to decide what you're going to prioritize in rebuttal. So the motion is quite simple. This house would require all legal guardians to prove their competency in raising a child to the state. So here are quick summaries of everyone's case. So let's go through them one case by case. So OG says a pretty simple case, like the way that we would mechanize this is that you're going to have a minimum baseline of parental competency and skills. So you need to know about, child nutrition, how you should discipline your child, you should know how to hygiene and healthcare, etc. So all the basic child rearing skills. And you need to prove that you have these skills to maybe a government official specialized in childcare before you're allowed to raise a family. And so you almost need to be licensed by the state to raise a family. And their main case after they come out with this model is that, it really prevents instances of child abuse and neglect before harms accrue. So you can say that, right now in status quo, the way that we deal with this is that, a family is already dysfunctional and they're already shown to be incompetent when raising a child. The problem is with that is that the harm has already been done to that child. They've been malnourished, they've been beaten, they've been neglected. And because of that, that's irreversible harm that could really, really damage a child's ability to grow up in the future. And so you can, like OG's case is like, look, we'd rather just prevent this harm from ever accruing to this child. And because of that, this child would never need to suffer or would never have to grow up into an adult who is dysfunctional in their life because of something they had no control over as a child. So that's the main case. Opening opposition comes up with a lot of arguments. They come up with like, this infringes upon the rights of individuals to have children. You shouldn't need to be licensed by the state to have a child. That's your own right as a human being. You should be able to have children. That should never be infringed upon. Second argument they talk about is that these barriers are likely going to be set too high. And so lots of couples are going to not be able to have children because the test will be too hard. Like it's too hard to get a license. And third arguments, they said that children will be torn from their parents or birth rates are going to plummet. So just like if you're going to have like such a high barrier of entry, children are going to be wrongly taken from their parents, or like people will just choose not to have children at all or be unable to have children, and birth rates are going to go down massively. So those are their arguments. Then CG comes up and says like, look, it's not just about it's not just about the test itself, it's about how this changes incentives of actors. And so you can say like, because parents know they have to do a test, they're going to be more prepared for childcare, so they're more able to, for example, more likely going to buy books to read up on childcare, where they learn a plethora of skills that you need to become a parent. Furthermore, the problem in lots of status quo situations is that often parents don't know what they're supposed to know before they have their first child. And now like you as a state provide them almost with like a syllabus they have to know. So you provide them with a checklist of requirements, which will help them prepare for maybe unexpected challenges. So for example, like parents maybe don't know how to deal with sex education when it comes up until it comes up. And so now you have like a checklist that prepares you for all these challenges before you actually encounter them, making you much more able to be a good parent to your child and not accidentally ruin your child's life because you handled that challenge badly. Third argument they say is that you're going to have better familial bonds because again, parents learn how to communicate and nurture children when they have more explicit and tangible guidelines about what is acceptable that is licensed by the state. So the problem is that in status quo, your relatives tell you something, like maybe you have like a conservative family that tells you should hate your children all the time, and then you have like mom's not telling you that vaccines are evil. So you always have this contradictory information that leads you to maybe sometimes have developed toxic or destructive bonds with your children because you do things that are not good for them. Because like, for example, like shouting at small children. Now that you have a syllabus and, a government saying that this is the correct way, like the officially correct way to raise a child, you have more assurance that this is going to be a good way to communicate with your child, more likely going to be less harmful than all the comparative avenues of information you're going to get. Because of this, you're going to have better familial bonds, just going to have a more functional family. So that's what CG is going to talk about. Now, you're in CO, right? Your amazing eccentric speaker has gone out there and has given the case that, you know, it's likely that these government officials are going to be mostly white. So there's a potential for lots of cultural minorities who have very valid methods of child rearing to be discriminated simply because they seem alien to maybe a more Caucasian culture. So for example, like on child nutrition, raising your child in a purely vegetarian household, if you're, for example, like you come from a religious minority that believes in that, or maybe it is something to do with discipline. So like maybe you come from a Black and minority ethnic background, and you believe that in order to succeed, your children need to be like doing loads and loads of extracurriculars, need to be pushed to strive for the absolute best, like that kind of tiger parenting mentality that loads of, for example, more privileged families see to be as too extreme. And so it's likely that lots of these kind of more like equally legitimate ways of child rearing are going to be wrongly discriminated, meaning that ethnic minorities or other sorts of minorities are going to be prevented from having children. So that's the main case in CO. So you're now up with what team should you prioritize first of all? So who, like, can anyone just shout out who is the best team in this room? Other than you, of course.
CG?
Yep. So I would agree. I think CG is probably the stronger team in the room, and then you should prioritize rebutting them. Who's next? After you deal with CG, who should you deal with next?
I was going to say OG, because like you could co-opt a lot of what CG says into your case.
So like OG and CG seem pretty similar. So I think that, yeah, you're right. I think OG comes quite close to CG in terms of like high impact, because that impact is quite huge. And I think, and people obviously identify that OO is not a good team. Cool. So how do you actually deal with these teams? So like, I think people correctly identify this as probably closing half debate, probably. US and WIP never truly know whether or not this is, unless it's like super obvious, like unless like both top half teams kind of like go up there, they just speak a bunch of gibberish on some other motion. Unless it's something like that, then you kind of like only roughly approximately know who the other strong team you should be identifying. So in this debate, it's kind of close between some teams. I think CG is marginally stronger because of that nuance and analysis. And I think a lot of the impacts are also quite high in terms of like getting a functional family, having parents be more prepared just to be good parents to their children, for example, being able to give them a good sex education that is hugely impactful in their adult life and stuff like that. And so how, like, let's talk about like, how do we, I don't want to go through every argument, but let's say like, how do we outweigh CG maybe? How do we maybe prove that govs clash about like preventing abuse or like, you know, preventing like familial, like bad familial bonds is irrelevant in the context of your case? I think I phrased that really badly. Yeah, go ahead, Yusuf.
Can you just provide like a bunch of alternatives? In that, like, if the main claim from CG is that this provides them with like checklists and resources which they can use to inform themselves and educating, you can just give those to them anyway.
Yeah. So you can prove that, okay, number one, you can prove that all the impacts are non-unique. So you can say that, look, all the harms that we brought you are unique to this motion because they talk about setting clear guidelines by government officials, but however, gov's benefits are non-unique to the motion. So if it's about like preventing abuse, or it's about like, you know, making you more prepared and able to be a parent, you can already probably give that support as a state. So you can probably teach parents how to be good through PSA programs or something like that. You can, you know, when they go to a pediatrician for the first time, have loads of materials ready for them at the GP or something like that. And so because of that, you can prove the non-uniqueness of a lot of their benefits. Anything else? So note that what's really like, up, like if you're a whip speaker, if you're just any second speaker, your goal in life is to love your case, it's to love your first speaker. And the special thing that your first speaker has done in this debate is that they've questioned a really critical thing that underpins all of Gov's arguments, and that is whether or not the model actually is good. So like with that in mind, can anyone take that a step further up about how to rebut all of Gov bench?
Yeah, so like especially CG, given the fact that their extension mainly relies on the fact that these guidelines are going to be good for parents and parents are easily able to access them, and your extension is about like minorities, a lot of them are going to speak like a different language or just outright reject the norms and just resent the people who are forcing them into this. So they'll just hate your government and not do these things and just not be able to have kids.
Yeah, I think that's a legit argument, or a legit rebuttal. I think so like building on this idea, so I think it's definitely true, just to repeat what was said. So you can say that it's probably, even if these government guidelines are really good, highly likely that it seems very foreign to lots of the most vulnerable communities or the most disenfranchised communities. Because of that, they won't probably, even if your benefits exist, it won't accrue to the most vulnerable in your society, the most disenfranchised, because they don't trust the establishment. Their ways of parenting seem quite foreign and alien, and it's likely that they're not able to access it because they are disenfranchised from the governmental systems. Anything else?
Oh, check chat. I think Tom and Vicky are talking in the chat.
It's so hard for me to screen share and then see the chat at the same time. Yeah. Okay. Attacking the premise. So most parents don't want to neglect their children. You know that not providing adequate. Yep. Yeah, you can see. Yep. So you can say like. So I think this is undermining the necessity. So this is a different way of rebutting a case. Is that so? Yusuf talked about proving the non-uniqueness of benefits. Vicky is talking about proving the, I guess, the how do you say it? But like, it's also kind of non-uniqueness. So or just proving there's a problem solution mismatch. So Vicky's rebuttal is just to say like, look, parents already are incentivized to care for their children when they are born. So it's highly likely that they don't want to neglect their kids. And just because of this, you're not actually making a meaningful change. So you often, so often like parents end up being dysfunctional parents, or they end up being inadequate parents simply because they have this lack of resources to things like food or things like social security. And what you're doing is like you're actively disallowing them to have any children. So you can prove that there's a problem solution mismatch, which is another way of showing, of rebutting a case. So Tom says, a consideration of characterization, government seems to rely on government doing a good job. Yep, exactly. So this is the thing that I was trying to point towards. So Tom has hit the nail on the head, which is to say, so reading out Tom's comment, a consideration of the characterization, government's case seems to rely on the government doing a good job at this, which clashes with CO quite strongly. And so the entire crux of your case from CO is that these guidelines are not fair. They're not even considered universally good parenting. These are not objective standards that you can hold everyone to. And maybe even like if you come from a poor minority background, the kind of just like, oh, chill, do what you want in school, do like you be your individual, like trying to cultivate your child's individualist spirit or whatever, that may be good for maybe children who come from more privileged backgrounds, who have stable households and have very good education systems. Maybe that kind of parenting is good for them, but maybe it doesn't truly apply to, for example, immigrant communities that may struggle and may feel compelled to have their kids strive to be excellent in order to succeed as adults in the future. And so because of that, you can question whether or not these guidelines are actually, like, do they actually constitute good parenting? Because if these guidelines are actually actively detrimental to a lot of communities and their specific needs and what their children need, they can say like, then all of Gov's impacts fall, right? Because at best, if these standards are set by the privileged and they only benefit the privileged, then the impacts are really, really minuscule. And if you force like more disenfranchised communities to conform to those actively bad standards that don't suit their community's needs, then that's actively bad parenting that you're enforcing within that community. So that's taking what your extension member has proven, that these standards are not objective and not applicable to every community, and weaponizing it to hurt all of Gov's case more. So note that I'm not just repeating what my extension speaker has said. So I'm not just saying, I'm not just saying, but my extension speaker already told you that loads of minorities will be disenfranchised. I'm taking that premise, which is that these standards are not objective, and I'm using it and flipping it to flip all of Gov's analysis about, like, instead of accruing benefits, enforcing these standards would actually accrue harm in lots of communities, because maybe parenting wouldn't be good, maybe parenting wouldn't be possible under the government standards. Tom has a question. So question why the mechanism will stop child abuse. Parents who abuse their children probably know how to care for their children. They abuse their children because of stress in their lives or because they're bad people. So again, so this is good. So this is kind of like Vicky's argument, which is to say, like, you can do more sorts of like problem solution mismatch. So the problem with abusive parents is that it's not that like they're like kind of stupid or incompetent or unable to pass a test, but maybe they are just kind of terrible people who like to take out stress on children. And so because of that, this wouldn't really prevent any of the more extreme cases of abuse from actually happening. So yeah, that's a good rebuttal. Could you maybe try and prove that the metric with which parents try and raise children are community or cultural more than regional? Yeah, you can. For example, Indian parents are more likely to fail American guidelines or Scandinavian guidelines in parenting, which will cause stuff like, that will prevent stuff like tiger parenting, meaning minority parenting will be even more non-exclusive. I'm not too sure what that's trying to prove. It seems like, I think that's just an example of closing opposition's case. If you want to like maybe clarify, maybe I can respond to it. Could you also make a module resource allocation case in rebuttal? What does this mean, Chris? If it's something like, don't do like oh no, dude, no. So like, okay, so if your rebuttal is just something like, but if you implement this motion, that means you're wasting time that you could be using to solve poverty. Like, okay, so like, don't, like, trade-offs are rarely ever like that, right? So I would say 99.999% of the time, running a resource allocation rebuttal is not going to be effective. Because like, it's just, unless you can prove that there is a strict and necessary trade-off from the most important things. Like, if you can prove without a shadow of doubt that running this license system means that a bunch of other things are neglected necessarily, that you would rather spend time on, then maybe you can run it. But I think in this specific scenario, you can't, because it's just like, you'll just be like, oh, but like, you're spending time and money that could be going towards solving global poverty and starvation. And then the other side's just going to be like, nah, it's fine. We're going to take it out of the war budget. We're going to take it out of like all the ministers. We're going to tax the rich and then give it to the poor. Some stuff like that. So you never want to engage in that stupid clash. So I would say 99.999% of the time, don't introduce a resource allocation rebuttal in a debate. Cool. So I think, okay, so like broadly, we've done good in this exercise. I think we've correctly prioritized the correct teams. Do you see how we utilized our own case and made our rebuttal coherent to our case? So it wasn't just like this independent thing where I tried to just rebut all the arguments from CG and OG and then OO, using rebuttals that my extension speaker never said, but rather I used the direction and logic of my constructive case to beat all other teams. So that's what I mean when we say that rebuttal has to be coherent and dependent on the constructive case. It needs to form one coherent worldview in order to make it super persuasive. And so that's how you can make rebuttal really, really powerful in a debate, because it seems to link really nicely to your extension. And that's how you also correctly prioritize the correct teams. Like quickly just going through why, like, if anyone is just confused about why OO is obviously the worst team in this debate, they just don't explain why they're impacts matter. Like, I don't know why birth rates falling matters or is negative. I don't know why couples not being able to have children is a negative. I don't also know why having children is an inherent right that people get to have, especially when OG has already talked about all the harms that could accrue if you're a dysfunctional parent. So that's why it's not the greatest team in the debate, and that's why CG or OG would be the one that you would prioritize more. Cool. So I believe that's all we have for the exercise. I think now we have a debate. Lucie, do we have a draw?
Yeah, we do. I think we can stop the recording at this point.